In this video, we're going to be talking about the concepts of absorption spectrum and also action spectrum in photosynthesis. But before we talk about that, I just want to do a little bit of revision. You see, in the chloroplasts, they have these things called thylakoid, and inside the thylakoid, they have these very important structures called photosystems. And if you remember, I told you that a photosystem is just a structure that contains photosynthetic pigments. And these pigments, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to absorb light. For example, in this photosystem over here, it is made out of something called the reaction center, and the reaction center is consisting of two chlorophyll A molecules next to each other. And of course, chlorophyll A is not the only pigment inside the photosystem. For example, in this particular photosystem, I'm throwing out 3 other photosynthetic pigments of different colors, and these are known as accessory pigments. And if you remember, the reason why the photosystem should have different type of pigments is because it is to allow the photosystem to absorb as much light as possible. Because light is not just a single thing. It is actually an electromagnetic wave consisting of different wavelengths. In fact, visible light falls under the range of 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. Right? So there are many different, I guess you can say, varieties of the wavelength of light. So having different types of pigments will allow the photosystem to absorb different types of light. So what do I mean by that? You see, as an example here, we will have to talk about a very important concept known as the absorption spectrum. And the absorption spectrum is just it's basically a graph that shows how well each photosynthetic pigment absorbs different wavelengths of light. And they may ask this definition in the exam. All right. So some students will look at that definition and go, I don't understand what exactly this means. What it just means is, you see, the photosystem has different types of pigments. The absorption spectrum is just a graph to tell you which pigment absorbs which wavelengths of light best. So as an example, I'm just drawing out the 4 pigments over here. You don't have to memorize the names of the pigments, don't worry. So I'm just going to call them pigments A, B, C, and D. And I'm also going to draw out a graph here. And the graph here on the y-axis is the absorption capacity, or just the absorption. And on the x-axis is the wavelength of light. I told you before that the wavelength of visible light falls under the range of 400 to 700 nanometers. Now, some students will ask the question, do I have to memorize that 400 to 700 nanometers? Well, you don't have to, but it's good to know that light, visible light at least, falls within that range. Now, I'm just going to draw out the absorption spectrum of pigment A, pigment B, pigment C, and pigment D. I do not need you to memorize this graph at all. It is not important for you to memorize the patterns. You just need to understand what this graph means. All right. So you have 4 lines there. Each line represents the absorption capacities of each pigments, and we're going to look at each of them one by one. So as you can see here, we're just focusing on pigment A, and I'm just throwing out, you can see the peaks over there. I'm putting an arrow down. So what this means is pigment A absorbs a lot of light when the light is in the wavelengths of about 420 to 520 nanometers. That's what that peak actually means right there. Okay. What about pigment B? If you look at pigment B, the absorption of pigment B, if you shine 400 to 500 nanometers, does it absorb a lot of those wavelength of light? No, it doesn't. It's good at absorbing light at around 600 to about 650 nanometers. So that's what pigment B is specialized for. Pigment C, however, if you see that in the graph, it absorbs a lot of light at about 600 nanometers, give or take, to about 700. Yeah, I know it's actually about 620 nanometers, but I'm just going to put it at 600 nanometers to 700 nanometers, just to give it a kind of round ballpark figure. But pigment D, however, is a little bit more interesting. Okay, when you look at pigment D over here, it's quite good at absorbing about 450 nanometers of light. But what about 500 to 600? Does it absorb a lot of light there? No, it's bad at doing so. It sucks. but it's also good at absorbing light at around 650 nanometers. So pigment D over here is good at absorbing light at the wavelengths of 450 nanometers or also 650 to 660 nanometers. This is what the absorption spectrum is saying. So what I'm just trying to tell you here is the graph tells you which pigments absorb which wavelengths of light best. It's as simple as that. Now, why do we have to care about their absorption spectrum? Well, the reason is as follows. The more light the pigment absorbs, it will increase the rate of photosynthesis because, it drives light-dependent reaction, it produces ATP and reduced NADP, which will then be used in light-independent reaction. It is as simple as that. So the next concept we have to see is something called the action spectrum. And it's just essentially a graph showing the overall rate of photosynthesis over a range of wavelengths of light. So the spectrum in this case here means the range of wavelength of light. That's the spectrum, the range. And action, what action are we talking about? The action is just the rate of photosynthesis. So as you can see here, and you don't need to memorize the action spectrum as well. You do need to memorize the definition, but you don't need to memorize the graph patterns. But you need to understand how the absorption spectrum affects the action spectrum. Now imagine in this situation here, this is a plant, a land plant or a terrestrial plant, and this plant has all four pigments. It has pigment A, pigment B, pigment C, and pigment D within the chloroplast or within the photosystem. So is this good? Well, this is quite good for the plant. So if we were to draw out another graph, which is the action spectrum, the action spectrum will usually have the rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis, because it's the overall rate of photosynthesis, against the x-axis, which is the wavelength of light. Now, let's imagine I shine 400 nanometers of light on the plant, which means it's just purely purple light. Will the plant do a lot of photosynthesis? Some students are like, how the hell do I know that? Well, you do have a reference. You can look at the absorption spectrum graph. So look at the 400 nanometers, which I'm highlighting over there. Does it actually absorb a lot of 400 nanometers? You can see the part where I've highlighted that. They do have pigments, but pigments A, pigment B, and also pigment D. Yeah, they can actually absorb 400 nanometers, but do they absorb a lot of 400 nanometers? Not really. So will it be a high rate of photosynthesis in this case? Not exactly too. There will be a bit of photosynthesis, but not much. What if we shine 450 nanometers of light, which is like bluish light in this case? Will the plant do a lot of photosynthesis? Well, let's look at the graph. Now, so look at the parts where I've just basically highlighted. In this case, for 450 nanometers, yes, pigment A and pigment D can actually absorb a lot of light in that case. As you can see, I'm circling over there. So the overall rate of photosynthesis will actually be quite high. What about 500 nanometers? Well, at 500 nanometers, you still have pigment A and pigment D. They can actually absorb a lot of light. Yes, if you notice, pigment B and C, they cannot absorb a lot of 500 nanometer. I'm circling that in blue over there, if you can see that. But the plant still has pigment A and pigment D to compensate for that. So a lot of absorption of 500 nanometers of light will still be taking place. So the overall rate of photosynthesis will be quite high, not so high, but still a little bit higher than usual. Okay, so I've plotted that in the graph of the action spectrum. What about 600 nanometers? Okay, at 600 nanometers, the pigments are not so good at absorbing that particular wavelength of light. So the overall rate of photosynthesis is low. And 700 nanometers, you can see that pigment B and also pigment C are fantastic at actually absorbing that particular wavelength of light. So in that case, the rate of photosynthesis will also be quite high. So the logic is as follows. If the plant has the pigment to absorb that particular wavelength of light, the rate of photosynthesis will be high. So that's how the absorption spectrum affects the overall action spectrum. If you still don't understand, let's look at a different one. Now, we have a unique looking seaweed over here. As you can see, the seaweed is just groups of plants that grow in the water. And look at that particular seaweed. It's not green in color. That particular seaweed is like a bluish, purplish color. The reason why that seaweed it has that kind of different type of color is because they have different types of pigments. As you can see here, for this particular seaweed, does it actually have all the pigments? No. They only have pigments B and pigment C in this situation. So how does it affect the rate of photosynthesis in this plant? If I shine 400 nanometers of light or 500 nanometers of light, will the plants have pigments to absorb this particular wavelength of light? Look at the graph. As you can see the graph over here, 400 and 500 nanometer, pigments B and pigment C suck at actually absorbing that wavelength of light. So in that case, they will actually reflect it. And when they reflect the light, that's why these particular seaweeds are actually a bluish and greenish color, because they cannot actually absorb that particular wavelength very effectively. So will the plant actually have a high rate of photosynthesis in this case? No, they won't, because the rate of photosynthesis is low. The rate of photosynthesis is low because they cannot absorb that particular wavelength of light very effectively. What about 600 nanometers? Let's look at 600 nanometers. Well, 600 nanometer, pigment C is not so good at absorbing 600 nanometers, but pigment B, the purple one, is actually quite good. It's not fantastic, but it's okay. So the rate of photosynthesis becomes slightly higher. But when you give 700 nanometers of light in this case, 700 nanometers will actually have more absorption. Pigments B and C are fantastic at actually absorbing that particular wavelength of light, as you can see in the absorption spectrum graph. So what will happen to the rate of photosynthesis? You bet. The rate of photosynthesis in this case, in the action spectrum, will be quite high. So as you can see over here, the reason why the action spectrum of the seaweed and the action spectrum of the land plant or the terrestrial plant, they don't have the exact action spectrum even if you give the same wavelength of light. The reason is because the land plant has 4 different types of pigments to maximize light absorption, but the seaweed only has 2 different types of pigments to maximize its light absorption. So that is how the absorption spectrum can actually cause an effect in the action spectrum.